Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordy,
And I'm Brad.
and welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case and Brad here, and potentially you guys.
Don't know a damn thing about it.
So, this week, we are going to be talking about a different type of true crime as we delve into the disturbing case of the London nail bomber, a man whose reign of terror throughout London caused millions of dollars worth of damage, took the lives of several people, and injured countless others. Over the course of 3 consecutive weekends, David targeted various minorities across the city, including the Black community, the Asian community, and the city's LGBT community, making him one of London's worst terrorists in modern times. And despite being caught before being able to carry out any more damage, his capture only led to the discovery of a much larger and more sinister problem plaguing the city's minorities. And I don't have anything else to add before we get right into it. So let's just get right into it. Other than maybe, have you heard of this case before, Brad?
I have not.
So perfect. Some of you guys may have heard it, especially some of our London or UK based listeners. This is a pretty infamous case over there, especially because I think this is actually the first case of a serial bomber in London, at least, maybe the whole UK. So it was huge news when it happened. So it's the evening of Saturday, April 17th, 1999, in South London, and the street of Electric Avenue in Brixton was bustling with shop vendors and customers. Now, this area has a section known as the Brixton Market, where both sides of the street are lined with various different kinds of shops, traders, and vendors. It's just after 5 p.m., and the streets are packed with the evening rush as people get off work and buy what they need before heading home. The area of Brixton is known for being home to a predominantly Black community and was not known for having much crime at the time. So no one that day expected what was about to happen until it was already too late. At approximately 5:10 p.m., a young blond man carrying a black sports bag was seen casually walking down Brixton Markets, and without saying a word, he casually walked up to the vendor stand of a young black woman before sitting it on the ground and walking off, disappearing into the crowd. Now, despite the unknown man's attempts to appear casual and not suspicious, he was behaving oddly enough that he did catch the attention of another vendor named Gary Schilling. Now, Gary noticed the man acting weird and kept his eye on him as he walked around the market with the bag. Seeing the man drop the mysterious bag and walk off without it caused Gary to go over and move the bag himself. His initial reaction, believing that it may be part of like a drug deal or a drug drop off, and he was like, all right, well, this is shady. I don't want nothing to do with it, but I'm going to move it away from everybody else. Now, he did walk it to the edge of the market and let it sit off to the side. But somehow in the hustle and bustle of the crowded market, the bag moved further towards the shops, where it was again spotted by a shop owner, but this time the bag was now making a strange ticking noise. The shop owner called several other vendors over to also check out the bag to see what they made of it, and that's when the owner of an Icelandic market decided to open it up and check out what was inside. And that's when he came face to face with a bomb less than an inch away from his face.
That's got to be terrifying.
Now, he would go on to describe the bomb as literally looking like the ones you would see in a cartoon. You know, like it had the old school, like metal alarm bells on it on either side of it. It was in a plastic Tupperware container and it was an unknown substance wrapped up. And most concerning of all, also inside the Tupperware container were several bags of nails.
So this guy just wants to create like a shrapnel bomb.
Yeah, and I'll get into it a little bit more later, but a nail bomb, like the purpose of a nail bomb is to cause as much damage, not just kill, but to maim and to rip. And that's the problem with shrapnel is very difficult to treat, very difficult wounds to heal and stuff like that because it's literally ripping, tearing. It's tearing the flesh from someone else and then shooting it into the body of another person. It's very, people who make nail bombs make it to cause maximum damage. Now, of course, his first immediate reaction was to warn everyone around him, we need to get back. I think this might be a bomb. But of course, he's also like, I think it's a bomb, but at the same time, I'm not a bomb expert.
I think I would actually just go ahead and say it's a bomb. It's better to be like, I was wrong than, hey, boom.
And that's the thing. And also, like, this all happens in the span of a couple minutes at most. But everyone's like trying to be like, I think it's a bomb. Call the police. What do we do with it? Do we touch it? Do we drop it? Like, what's going on? The streets are packed. So it's like, do we cause a panic? What is like, there's so much confusion because you're not expecting to open a bag and see a literal bomb.
And also, it's ticking, so it's probably a time bomb. But I would also think, hey, if I yell bomb, this guy may detonate it because they're probably watching in the distance. They want to see what they're going to do. I mean, this type of bomb and a shrapnel bomb, this person probably gets off on seeing the damage that it does.
And that's true. And so that's kind of what most people saw the bomb they thought. But as everyone tried to comprehend what he was saying, the guy that was like, I think there's a bomb, and some were just frozen in fear, several members went to call the police, but in the meantime, others tried to figure out what to do with the bag. No one wanted to touch it out of fear of it going off, and the market was already so crowded, it was impossible to round everyone up without causing a massive panic and possibly just making the situation even worse. Finally, one worker in the market, a 15-year-old boy, walked up and picked up the bag, carrying it to the edge of the market before running back to safety. Now, relieved that it was out of harm's way, at least for the time being, people still try to figure out how to handle the situation before the bag was moved yet again in a move that survivors of the event would say was too bizarre to believe. So, as people waited for the cops to come get the bomb, a known drug user, in one of the reports I read, they did refer to him as a crackhead, but we're just going to say drug user, in the area casually walked up to the bag, picked it up, and carried it back towards the center of the market. And as people screamed at him to drop it and that it was possibly a bomb, the drug user simply unzipped the bag, pulled the bomb out completely out of it, sat it down in front of another shop, and proceeded to run off and steal the sports bag that it came in. And that is one of those things where, and some of the things that like people are like, some people still don't believe me, but I will go to my grave telling you that is what happened. Just as officers arrived right after this at approximately 5:26 p.m., a shop owner only had time to yell out, "Hey, I think it's a bomb," before a large flash of light followed by a deafening boom filled the entire street. Within seconds, the peaceful evening erupted into chaos as the explosion was so powerful that it could be heard for over a mile away and even blew an entire car down the street. It shattered out the windows of every business on the street, and since it was a nail bomb, it sent dozens of nails flying in every direction into the crowd of innocent bystanders. 1,500 to be exact, going over 300 miles per hour. Now, as the massive dust cloud caused by the bomb began to settle, people began to scramble to help the injured and check for any deceased. Responders were at the scene within minutes and began the process of transporting all the victims to the nearby King's College Hospital for treatment. Now, witnesses at the scene described some of the horrific injuries they saw, which included seeing a man who had his leg and one of his arms blown off. Another had nails and glass embedded in their head, chest, and legs. Another had a large chunk missing from their side. And even a 7-year-old girl was found having nails embedded in her face and in her cheeks. So in total, the blast caused serious injuries to 48 people, with the youngest one being just 14 months old. Now, despite the extent of the horrific injuries, thankfully, no one died. However, the lives of dozens of people were still forever changed as multiple people required limb amputations, several were blinded and deafened by the blast, and so this was a permanent life-altering event.
And just think what it would have done if it went off where it was dropped at.
It would have caused untold amount of damage. But as the scene was cleared of injuries and an investigation began, it was clear from the get-go that this was a planned and targeted terrorist attack. The fact that it was a nail bomb also meant that whoever set the bomb off intended for it to cause maximum damage, as the whole point of one is to rip and tear at victims and cause some of the most complex injuries that are difficult to treat after the fact. But even though investigators determined that it was a targeted attack, they still couldn't figure out who the actual target was. At first, they initially believed that it may be a copycat of another recent terrorist known as the Mardi Gras bomber, or that it was related to possible Serbian terrorists that were seen in the capital. But it didn't take long for the initial shock of the bomb to wear off, and soon it was replaced by anger and outrage from the general public. London was no stranger to bombings, with the 1973 bomb attacks by members of the IRA still being very fresh in people's minds. But this was the first time that a bomb had intentionally been set off in the middle of a busy farmer's market, meaning that the targets were normal, innocent people just trying to shop for groceries. So this wasn't a political thing, it wasn't anything like that. Like, this was senseless, like these were innocent people just at the shop, and someone just had a desire to kill as many of them as possible.
And I'm guessing that people thought the size of it, you said it was like in a Tupperware can, that they thought they were far enough away from it, because I have to say, if there was a bomb on the street, potentially, I probably wouldn't be anywhere in that area, after I found out. And it sounds like it sat there for a little while.
It sat there for a little while before people started realizing what was going on, because people heard a ticking coming from it. Most people, unless you're being diligent, aren't going to pay attention to someone's bag sitting there, because, you always think,
Well, also, somebody picked it up and said, "Hey, I think this is a bomb," and moved it out. Somebody moved it further. It got moved back. So all that took time. And at that whole time, everybody's like, "It's a bomb." I think I would have, got out of Dodge.
and maybe some people did, and that's why it didn't thankfully kill anybody. But I think it's also one of those situations where it's so confusing, because no one is expecting to be walking down the street shopping for oranges, and then someone goes, "Hey, there's a bomb sitting right over there." So I get it. It's confusion, mass confusion, stuff like that. But right away, members of the Brixton community believed that it was a racist attack and did their best to convince the investigators of the same. Although the local PD announced that they were doing everything in their power to find the bomber, which included handing out descriptions of the attacker to people on the street and upping police presence in certain areas, the Brixton community still felt like they weren't taking it as seriously as if the bomb had went off in a more wealthy white neighborhood. The tension between the Brixton black community and the police goes back decades, and in 1999, they were still feeling the tension from the 1981 Brixton police riots. So between April 10th and April 12th, 1981, hundreds of people gathered in the street of Brixton to protest the racial discrimination they had been facing from the local PD, and it did not take long for the protests to turn violent, as a massive brawl broke out between the protesters and the police, resulting in an event known as Bloody Saturday, in which 279 members of the police force and 45 members of the protesters were seriously injured in the fight. So when I say protest, I mean massive protest. Over 100 cars and a dozen businesses were also destroyed in the chaos before things finally settled down. Now, since then, tensions between the community and the PD remained high, and following the nail bombing, they only got worse. As part of their effort to catch the bomber, the PD began to swarm the Brixton area, which may sound good in theory, but it also made things worse. People and businesses were subjected to random searches and raids, including being arrested and brought in for questioning and coming out covered in bruises. People were detained just walking down the street, and many in the community felt that the PD were using the bombing just as an excuse to also further harass them. And now, while that can't be proven or disproven, investigators were truly working around the clock to try and figure out who the bomber was. Eventually, they started to believe that it was possible the bomber was part of a larger organization or affiliated with some form of hate group, and so they began asking the undercover agents at several of these groups to ask around and to investigate. One undercover officer was a man known only as Arthur, who in 1999 was deep undercover as a radical Nazi in the British National Party, or BNP for short. Now, the BNP is a very far-right, fascist political party that leans heavily into the teachings of Nazism and white supremacy. So, while you get an idea of what you're dealing with here. It was founded in 1982 by a man named John Tyndall, and by 1999 had grown in extreme popularity with thousands of members across the UK, many of whom would organize large-scale protests where they would walk around through the streets giving Nazi salutes and calling for, quote, rights for whites. And one of the reasons they were so popular, if you listen to an episode a few weeks back where we covered the murders of Gary and Winfield, also by members of a radical fascist group, part of it was because in 1999, so many people thought the world was going to end in 2000 because of Y2K. Now, Arthur, who to this day has his identity protected due to still being undercover in these types of groups, stated that on the first day, new people are brought into the BNP, the leaders would tell them that it's okay to kill Jews, blacks, and fags, and that they actively encourage members to assault minorities in the street. So this isn't even just like a fascist group where they're like, oh, we hate minorities. This is a group that actively tells their members, like, we encourage you, like, if you see a black person or a gay person, like, go beat them up, assault them. Like, you're encouraged to do that. Now, as Arthur attended many of these meetings, which took place at various locations, including the back rooms of pubs, shops, homes, and even inside of several churches. During these meetings, leaders would hand out pamphlets that actually gave instructions on how to build bombs and carry out terrorist attacks. And although the leaders made sure to never actually instruct their members on what to do, they heavily encouraged members of the BNP to act on their hatred for minorities and to carry out attacks on their own free will. So they weren't dumb enough to be telling their members like, hey, here's how to make a bomb, go bomb somewhere. They were like, here's just this casual pamphlet with these instructions. You do what you want, but like a good white supremacist would build a bomb and go blow up a synagogue. And so they were like laying the roots and actively hoping that one or more of their members would carry out a terrorist attack. So there was always an air of the leaders just hoping that one day a member would actually go through with it. But they were smart enough to not actually tell them to do it. But in recent years at this point, the BNP had been growing more bold and had become a problem for London PD as their protests would often turn violent, and on several occasions resulted in massive brawls breaking out in the streets between the BNP and the public, and during one incident resulted in a member of the BNP attacking several people with a hammer. So it does seem very likely that the nail bombing may have been carried out by a member of the BNP, but sadly, as of right now, police had no actual evidence or suspects to go on, and the case went cold for a very brief time. That is until exactly 7 days later after the Brixton bombing, when the attacker would strike again.
So he's wasting no time.
He does not waste any time.
Or she, we don't know yet.
These bombings take place over the course of 3 consecutive weekends. So no wasting time at all. So now on Saturday, April 24th, in the area of Brick Lane in East London, at just after 5:30 p.m., a camera captured a blonde-haired man casually walking down the street with a large black sports bag in his hand. The man lingers by a row of parked cars along the street and seems to contemplate something before dropping the bag directly on the sidewalk and just walking off. Now, just a few minutes later, a man walking down the street spotted the bag and, believing it to be suspicious, grabbed it and loaded it into the trunk of his Ford Sierra and drove to the police station to drop it off.
Or the boot, since we're in the UK.
He did say boot in the report I read, but I made it trunk just for our, American listeners, but also boot if you're in the UK. However, when he arrived at the police station, he found that it was actually closed. And that, which is weird to me. I've never heard of a police station being closed. What if you did need an emergency? Maybe that's a UK thing. Maybe that's an American thing. I don't know.
I think police stations do close, because I called one when someone tried to rob my father, and I got a, hey, if you're needing somebody right now, call this number because we close at 5:30.
Well, that's crazy, especially if you really do need legitimate help. They're like, 5 o'clock, we're gone.
But I figured that was just kinda like since it's a small town PD, and everything. I didn't think about it being London.
Yeah, so maybe one of our London listeners can explain that one better. So he couldn't drop it off, but he decided to keep it and then drop it off the following day. Driving back to the area of Brick Lane and parking his car along Hanbury Street, he got out and left it there and kind of forgot about it. Not even a minute after the man got out of the car, a deafening boom would erupt and his car would explode into a ball of fire. So also there's a lot of close calls here, and that just a lot of what ifs, like so many more people, like people died in this case, but so many more people could have died if it wasn't for this strange set of circumstances. Like he made it out of his car with a less than a minute to spare before the bomb went off and blew his car up. At the market in Brixton, people kept moving the bag and it ended up in just the right location where nobody died. People were seriously hurt, but at least they made it with their lives. And so it's all those weird kind of circumstances.
And probably since it was in the boot of the car, the shrapnel aspect got lessened because it's inside of enclosed space. So even if it did blow it apart, the initial blast throwing all that out, it actually at least lessened it.
And it actually did, but people still got hurt. 13 people would be injured in this explosion, with 5 being serious enough to go to the hospital. But again, thankfully, no one was killed. Although several businesses and cars were destroyed, police were immediately called to the scene and right away could tell that this attack was connected to last week's attack in Brixton. And like last week's attack, this one was targeted towards another minority community. So the area of Brick Lane was actually home to a very large Bangladeshi community and was often the target of bigoted vandalism and threats. One thing police also theorized right away is this time the bomber messed up. So the Brick Lane Bangladesh community hosts a very large street market on Sunday evenings after 5 p.m., and investigators theorized that this was when the bomber intended to attack and leave the bomb, but he got the dates wrong. And instead of altering his plan, he chose to just continue with the attack and just left the bomb on the sidewalk, which would explain why he loitered in the area for a second, trying to think of what to do next. So again, another coincidence. If the bomber had not gotten the dates wrong, there's no telling how many people would have died, how many more people would have gotten hurt. And so it's those weird series of circumstances. But now there have been 2 large-scale bombings in just a week, and London was now in a state of panic. The city had never had a serial bomber before, and the fact investigators had yet to catch him put everyone on edge and made people afraid to leave their houses. But as investigators scrambled to find the bomber, they now had a new problem. The news of a second bomb going off thrust the story into national spotlight all over the country, and this of course led to a number of people and hate groups sending in letters and placing phone calls to the PD claiming credit for the attacks. This of course threw the investigation off, as they had to take each claim seriously and investigate it, and that took away valuable time to catch the actual bomber before he would strike again. Now Arthur, remember the undercover cop in the BMP, began to ask around and try to find any information on the bomber, but found that not many people in the BMP knew much about him either. But they all applauded him as a hero. As the week wore on, little movement in the case was made, as police were still no closer to finding the London nail bomber, and sadly, they would not find him until after his third, final, and deadliest bomb would go off, changing London's queer community forever. Now, the following Friday, after the Brick Lane bombing on April 30th in Soho area of London, dozens of people gathered at the Admiral Duncan pub located on Old Compton Street to celebrate the weekend with a few drinks.
I've been to Admiral Duncan's pub, I believe.
I was actually just about to ask. I've never been to London, but I know Brad's been to London. So I was about to say, like, does Soho, Old Compton Street, the Admiral Duncan pub sound familiar?
I think it was like I was explained that it was a bear bar, so I was like, okay, I'll go to a bear bar. So I believe it's the one, Admiral Duncan's pub. I'll have to look back at my pictures and everything, but I believe I was there. Definitely been in Soho. I mean, as all good gay men from the States do, so
I do want to visit Soho. I just want to visit London. But yes, Soho is kind of like San Francisco or New York City here in America. It is a hotbed for queer people. And sounds like a fun time,
and I'm a sucker for a British accent.
aren't we all? Now, the Admiral Duncan was first opened in 1832. And of course, it wasn't a gay bar that whole time. But over the years, it has changed hands and themes dozens of times. And by 1999, the bar had become known as a popular gay bar. Despite not being marketed as one, it was one of those cases where it's not a gay bar. Like, that's not what it was intended to be. But it just gradually became one and became a popular hangout spot for gay people because it proved to be a safe haven due to its location in Soho at the heart of London's queer community. Now, homosexuality had been decriminalized in London since 1967, and London, like San Fran or New York City, became a safe haven for queer people as the large and diverse population proved to be more accepting than in other parts of the world. Although London's queer scene had faced its fair share of problems over the decades, the Soho area continued to be a growing and safe area for the community as the streets were lined with bars and shops dedicated to queer people, and it was one of the only places in the city where members of the community felt safe enough to walk down the street holding hands or just be who they are, not afraid to show who they actually are. Now, following the two bombings the previous 2 weekends, it was clear to everyone in the city that the bomber was intentionally attacking different minority groups, and the question became which group would he go after next? Would it be the city's Asian community or the Jewish community? And while this discussion was being had amongst the police and the media, one group that both of them failed to consider was an attack on the queer community. Officials believe the bomber was only targeting racial stereotypes, not sexuality, and didn't see it as a big concern. But that didn't mean members of the queer community weren't thinking about it. But as the week wore on, following the Brick Lane bombing, everyone in the city began preparing for where the bomb might go off next. Various queer organizations began calling up every gay bar they could get a hold of and warning the managers and owners to be hyper vigilant that coming weekend and to be on the lookout for any suspicious activity, as they very well could be next. But thankfully, by the time Friday, April 30th rolled around, police had been making great progress on finding out the bomber's identity. Arthur's snooping around the BNP groups was proving to be successful, and during his questioning, he discovered a hit list that was also being distributed to the BNP members, which was a list that included over 100 names of prominent members of various minority communities, and it was used alongside the pamphlets on how to make bombs to encourage the members to carry out attacks on their own accord. So they're literally giving, like, here's how to make a bomb, and here is a list of very prominent members in all these different minority communities if you need a target.
But we're not telling you to do it.
But we're not telling you to do it. You just have this information to do what you may, which I think distributing pamphlets on how to make bombs that are used to make bombs is still illegal.
You can get them on the internet.
You can actually get them on the internet, but don't do it. But on top of this, Arthur began collecting a list of names from other members, people whom multiple people agreed seemed the most likely to be radicalized enough to actually go through with an attack like this. And on that list, one name really stood out after being brought up multiple times: David. However, Arthur didn't have a last name yet, only that it was a young man named David who lived in Barking. But now, at the same time as this is happening, investigators were able to trace the bomber through various CCTV cameras until finally they found a semi-clear image of his face, and within the hour, thousands of posters with his face on it were printed and hung all over the city, urging anyone with information to come forward to police. Now, by noon that day, David himself would later tell investigators he saw himself on the poster and thought, quote, "Well, that's it then. They've caught me."
So I might as well go out with a bang, let me guess.
Well, and then he went home expecting to be greeted by police. So he's like, yeah, it was fun. I'm done for. But when that didn't happen, he realized the police may have his picture, but they still didn't know his name. And so he became determined to carry out at least one final attack, this time on the queer community because, according to him, quote, I can't stand queers. I don't know why. I just do. They disgust me. At 4 p.m., David loaded his bomb into a sports bag and got a taxi to take him to Soho. As just about the same time, Arthur saw the image of the suspected bomber on the poster and realized that the David from Barking he had heard about in the BMP and the image on the wanted poster matched perfectly with a young man he had actually come to know during his time in the BMP. 23-year-old David Copeland. Now, as he passed this information off to investigators, they began to dig into David's background and match up his movements and the actions with those of the London nail bomber. Meanwhile, while this is happening, David was dropped off in Soho and began to walk the streets looking for the best pub to destroy, and that's when he set his sights on the Admiral Duncan. This weekend was actually a holiday weekend, and it was a long weekend. The weather was perfect, so hundreds of people were lining the streets and into the pubs. David walked into the Admiral Duncan, sat at the bar, and ordered a drink. As he sat there drinking his Coke, he looked around at the crowded and lively bar, and he would later state, quote, I looked around at all the people I was about to maim and kill. I didn't feel joy in it, but at the same time, I also didn't feel sad about it. David was in the bar for about 20 minutes before he decided to leave, pushing his way through the 30 to 50 people packed inside, leaving behind his black sports bag containing the bomb at the bar. Now, as the patrons of the Admiral Duncan laughed, danced, and continued to enjoy the evening, no warning was given before a loud boom erupted and the entire building filled with smoke and fire, and debris and nails were shot out into the crowd and the packed streets outside. Survivors of the blast stated that it happened in an instant. One moment everything was normal, and then within a split second, the entire world went black around them. The bomb went off at 6:37 p.m., and it was clear right away that this was by far the worst of the 3 bombs that had been set off by the London nail bomber. 79 people would be seriously injured as dozens of people were scattered on the streets of Soho, covered in blood, debris, and dust. People missing limbs, large head wounds, and destroyed cars and shop windows were everywhere. Officers arriving at the scene would later describe it as looking like a war zone as people wandered the street bloody and in a daze. People laid unconscious in the street, and several bodies were being moved out of the Admiral Duncan pub. Ambulances attempted to move as many people as they could to the nearby hospital, but it was clear it wasn't enough. After the dust had settled, it would be revealed that the blast had not only injured 79 people, but had also killed 3 people inside the Admiral Duncan closest to the blast. A group of friends had gone to the pub that night to celebrate, and only one of them would survive. Julian Dykes would be found seriously wounded and unconscious inside the pub, and he was quickly rushed to the hospital where he remained in a coma for several days before waking up and discovering the horrible news. And this is actually very sad, so prepare yourself. Not only had his 2 best friends, 31-year-old Nick Moore and 32-year-old John Liss, been killed in the blast, but also his wife of 2 years, 27-year-old Andrea Dykes, had also been killed along with her baby, as the reason the group had gathered that night at the pub was to celebrate Andrea being 4 months pregnant and to ask John if he wanted to be the baby's godfather. Despite being an attack towards the queer community, none of the victims killed identified as members of the community. Imagine that you go to just hang out with friends, people you love, to announce your wife's 4 months pregnant, to ask your best friend if he wants to be the baby's godfather. It's such a joyous, amazing time. And then literally in a split second, all of that's gone. Now, as news of the bombing spread across the city, investigators realized that it was now or never and went out to arrest David Copeland at his home just 2 hours after the bomb went off at the Admiral Duncan. David was renting a room at an apartment located on Sunnybank Road, and upon opening the door to investigators, he immediately told them, quote, yeah, they were all done by me. I did them on my own, before being arrested and taken down to the station without incident. And that was something too that really got me at researching it, is like, this is like so many moving parts. Like, investigators were so, like, they knew who he was, before the last bomb went off. But of course, it's like we got to investigate to make sure we're not just busting into some random dude's house. And during that time, sadly, they had no idea that the last bomb would go off and it would be by far the worst. Now, he would later admit that he wanted to get caught, as one thing he wanted out of these bombings was fame and recognition from other far right extremists. When asked why he did it to begin with, David was very open with investigators, stating he did it to spread fear, hatred, and resentment across the city, and proudly stated that he was a Nazi.
What a guy.
Yeah, what a guy. So, who the hell is David Copeland? David Copeland was born on May 15th, 1976, and was the youngest of three brothers born to his parents. The family lived in an upper middle class home, and by all accounts, David enjoyed a normal and healthy childhood, with his parents describing him as a happy and intelligent kid. David does recall that as a child and into his early teen years, he did have an irrational fear that he might be gay, as his parents would often sing the theme song to the Flintstones, which has a line stating, quote, "We'll have a gay old time," which he took as them trying to convince him that he was gay. And this is not, we'll find here in just a second, he would later be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Now, as he got older and into high school, David began to pull away from his family and often kept to himself, with his teachers and former classmates stating that they hardly remembered him at all, as he never interacted or participated in activities with them. David would later reveal after his arrest that starting at the age of 12, he began to have sadomasochistic dreams in which he imagined himself as a Nazi officer and who kept women as sex slaves.
He just gets better and better.
Yeah, very, type of guy you want to bring home to mom. David dropped out of school in high school and chose to enter the workforce, but due to his lack of an education, he found little in the way of jobs that paid any actual money. Now, instead of blaming this on the fact that, he dropped out before he finished school, David grew angry and blamed his lack of good jobs on illegal immigrants. This led to him joining the BNP in May of 1997 when he was just 21 years old. He began acting as a steward to the party's leaders, including the head of the BNP, John Tidal. Now, for a year, he was a devout follower of the party until he left the group in May of 1998, believing that the BNP was failing due to its inability to carry out actual attacks on minorities. So he said,
They don't hate enough.
The BNP, who passes out pamphlets on how to make a bomb and hit lists of all the prominent leaders in these minority groups, they're not radical enough. We need to be taking actual action, so I'm going to leave. Now, it was not long after leaving the BNP that David went to his family doctor and asked to be prescribed antidepressants as he, quote, felt like he was losing his mind. Following his arrest, David admitted that his ultimate goal in life was to cause a race war from the bombing and that he wanted to kill as many people as possible. Even more disturbing, and just to show you how sadistic he really was, so several victims of the Admiral Duncan pub bombing, in the days following the bombing, they started to develop a really weird but really aggressive infection, and doctors were kind of stumped as to what actually was going on. Well, it turns out that David revealed that he dipped all the nails he planted in the bombs in rat feces and poison in order to coat them with bacteria and cause even more pain and damage to his victims.
I was fixing to say there's feces involved.
So even more, just like, it wasn't even just enough to maim people with nails. He was like, on top of that, I want to give them sepsis and cover them in poop, so it causes even more internal damage. Like, that's next level. David stated that he was not sorry for what he did and that his only regret was that he wished he killed more people. He was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, but while being housed awaiting trial, 5 doctors diagnosed David as having paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Now, his lawyers tried to use this to get the murder charges against him lowered, but people weren't having that. People usually don't have a lot of sympathy for a domestic terrorist.
Especially when they say, I just wish I would have killed more people. That's the only thing I regret.
Yeah, and especially when one of those victims was a 4-month pregnant woman. On June 30th, 2000, David Copeland was found guilty and convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and for planting bombs, and for that he received 6 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Despite trying to appeal his sentence several times over the years, all of them have been denied. David continues to sit in jail, and as recently as 2015 actually had extra charges added on to his sentence after stabbing a fellow inmate with a shank. So he's not changed in 20 plus years. Now, the Admiral Duncan was rebuilt, and it continues to operate and remains a beacon of hope for London's queer community.
I almost thought there for a second, I was like, wow, if this place got blown up, maybe that was not where I went. And then I was going to start looking it up afterwards, but I'm pretty sure that's where I went.
It's supposed to be really popular. Again, London listeners can confirm that, but it is one of the most iconic bars in Soho.
It was one of the bars they were like, you have to go to the Admiral Duncan and see it. So,
And if you do go there today, you will find a plaque is now in the pub honoring the memory of those lost during the 1999 nail bombing.
now see, I would have looked for that if I would have known. So I learned something new.
Mm-hmm.
Was tragic and horrible, but I learned something new and I would have looked for the memorial.
Well, I definitely want to go to London. I think that might be one of the next trips I want to take out of the country is to London. I don't know. Heard a lot about it, so I want to experience it for myself. But yes, that is the story of, again, one of the most senseless acts in history. Like, no reason. And even investigators kept asking me, he's like, why? Like, I mean, I know, like, you're racist, you're a Nazi, but, like, what happened to make you such a racist and a Nazi that you became a domestic terrorist on all these just farmers markets with children, bars with pregnant women, stuff like that. And he literally said, he's like, I don't know. I just hate them. And that shows you how terrifying these types of groups can be, like these radical groups, because it also goes back when he couldn't get a good job. His first thought is, no one wants to blame themselves. Everyone's always looking, people like this, for someone else to blame. So, he can be like, these groups are also probably telling him, like, it's not your fault that you can't get this good job. It's not the fact that you didn't finish school, like even high school. It's that illegal immigrant. He's the one that took your job. You should be mad at him, not yourself. And it gives people a scapegoat to take their anger and aggression out on. But it also shows you how these can quickly spiral if they're not kept under control, because the BNP was passing out instructions on how to build bombs and hit lists. So, and thankfully it has died down a little in recent years. There's not as many members, like a couple hundred. They're not as vocal as they once were. So hopefully one day they die out. And with that, thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and the podcast as a whole, please leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot, helps other people discover the podcast. And of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you want to see photos from today's case, you can follow us on Instagram at Beers with Queers Pod, that's POD, or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until next week, stay dangerous out there, my friend.
See you soon.